All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening for the webinar. Tonight, we will cover strength training for runners, how to build functional strength and injury resistance from the comfort of your home. Reason I wanted to hold this topic is because things have been so thrown off over the last 6 months. Gyms have been closed. Kids are doing virtual learning. And you may be working from home. So just trying to eliminate any excuses, any need for equipment, getting to gyms, just allowing people to realize there's a lot you can do at home on your own. So hopefully we can kind of continue to stay on track regardless of what gets thrown at us, that you can continue making progress. I know most people continue to run, which is great and no limitations there, but continuing to do some of those supplemental strategies will be super important long time rather than taking big chunks of time off. Before we get started, do me a favor, silence any technology, turn off cell phones. I have a lot of good content, a lot of videos I want to go through today showing you various exercises and things. So I want to make sure you get the most from that. Take a second right now, locate the Q&A function. There is a panel somewhere, top of your screen, bottom of your screen, might be a floating panel that moves around or is hidden at certain points. If you click that Q&A button, that will be a way for you to write any comments, feedback, or questions throughout the webinar. Feel free to drop a question at any time. If there's something that you want to make sure I get to over the next 50 minutes or so, drop a question, comment, anything in the Q&A right now, and I'll try my best to get to that. At the end of the webinar, we'll be raffling off 1 free month in the Healthy Running Program. We'll talk a little bit about that. Decided just a few moments ago, going to give away again, 1 free month to 2 people. So we'll talk about that as we get to that, but I want to get into the content here. And then make sure you are checking your email tomorrow at 11 a.m. For those of you that can't stick around the entire time or just want to reflect back on this content, I will be sending the webinar replay. The raffle winner will go at 11 a.m. So by 11:10, if you don't see anything from me, check your spam folder or reach out directly because there will be something sent out to you. All right, so let's get started. What to expect from this webinar today. We're going to cover some of the background information first, just take a few minutes on that and the science of running. So some of the research on strength training, how it relates to performance and injury prevention, and then also just kind of covering the demands of running so you can understand what are some of the things we want to accomplish with our strength training program. Then the key principles that should guide your program. This is super important in an area that most people don't fully understand or really take the time to dig deeper in. Most people want to know, what are the exercises? Tell me what to do. But at a certain point, we plateau, we fail to progress. There needs to be a lot of other adjustments made to the program. So hopefully these principles that we covered today will help you understand what things need to change alongside your running so you can see the best long-term results rather than just those couple exercises that you do over and over again. And then we'll cover, obviously, the most effective strength training exercises, again, as it relates to the demands and the mechanics of running. We've got quite a few exercises to get through, so let's get started. My name is Garrett McLaughlin. I am a licensed athletic trainer and strength conditioning coach in West Bloomfield, Michigan, been living here about a year or so. I run what is called the Healthy Running Program. Program is designed both in person and remote, so regardless of where you live, we still do running analysis, movement assessment, rehabilitation, strength training, functional training programs. So regardless of what your goals are, whether you're trying to get faster, move better, or reduce your likelihood of injury, very good program geared specifically for runners. Before we get into the main content, one thing I recommend you to think a little bit more about is what's the why behind all this, behind your being a runner, behind your strength training. A lot of times I see people with these very short-sighted goals. Hey, I want to get faster. Hey, I want to reduce the chance of injury. What are the bigger reasons behind that? A lot of people lose motivation at some point. Say, hey, I'm sick of, feel like I'm in this structured routine of following the running plan, doing my strength training, and I'm losing motivation. But if we can connect that with the deeper intrinsic why, usually we have again, more intrinsic motivation behind to keep us accountable, to keep us motivated on track to achieving that. So take a second. I'm just kind of interested in who we have on the webinar here today. I want to launch a quick poll. Some of you will see this, some of you won't, depending on how you're signed on to Zoom right now. But give me an idea of kind of who's on the other end of the screen here. How would you classify yourself as a runner? Are you a beginner, intermediate, elite? How long have you been incorporating strength training? One thing I'm very interested in hearing, we have a lot of people that are brand new to strength training that haven't incorporated it before or new to incorporating it, or people that have been doing it for years and just trying to fine tune things. And then take a second on that third question. What is the why behind all this? Why does this matter to you, right? Are you looking for happiness, pain reduction, longevity? I mean, there's a lot of different things that we can strive for in our life as a community, identity, cardiovascular, brain, joint. I mean, there's a lot of different things behind the scenes here when it comes to the why that we are chasing these goals when it comes to running and strength training. So shoot a quick comment in the Q&A. Would love to hear from you, a few of you hopefully on what that is. And let's get a few people through this poll right now. We've got a smaller crowd on here tonight, which I think is, I always like the smaller groups. So we've got about 20, 25 people here. And shoot me a comment there. What is the why behind it all? What are you chasing? Continue to incorporate strength training long into the future. How's it going, Tammy? Mary, long-term health, personal satisfaction. Awesome. Scott, want to run into my 80s. Big goal of mine as well, longevity. Big thing I kind of chase in my program, again, trying to be functional, continue to move, have the mobility, the strength, and just like the quality of movement to continue to move long into life. Injury-free, more complete fitness. Awesome. Something I can do long-term. Stronger core and stability. Started for weight loss, now for mental health. Awesome. To be like my grandpa, live to at least 95. That's great. Everything. Awesome. Longevity and happiness. Awesome. Continue to write those in there, guys. I want to make sure I'm not taking up too much here. So just to see in terms of that poll, who we have here, I'm going to share the results with you guys. So you guys can also see who's on here. A lot of intermediate runners, or would classify yourselves as intermediate. No elite, couple newbies. How long you've been incorporating strength training. So people that are again, kind of a mix here, a few that have been doing it more than 4 years, but majority and under 2 years. Okay, so let's get through here. Plenty of content to get through. So when it comes to the demands of running, we need to understand the actual sport of running before we go ahead and just implement some kind of strength training program alongside it, because it needs to be specific enough to carry over for you to see the results. Running is a very single leg plyometric like activity. There's really no instance where you're on 2 legs. You're pretty much bounding from one leg to the next, having to absorb force, push off, remain stable and in a very efficient position. Good thing about running is it's a predictable movement and loading pattern. So predictability comes with it, and an advantage that we know specifically the demands, the biomechanics, the forces as they relate to the sport of running. So good from a performance standpoint. We know specifically if we improve these things, we'll become a better runner. On the other end of the spectrum, completing the same repetitive movements over and over again also increases your risk of injury. So if we know we're always completing this movement pattern from mile and mile on end, other aspects of our strength training program, our other daily activities, other sports potentially could be to move us in multiple planes and motions outside of what we typically see with running. That's a very good strategy from an injury reduction standpoint. A lot of people don't realize while running and that foot strike and that loading response of running, your body experiences anywhere from 2 to 6 times your body weight in terms of force. So running is a very demanding sport. We need to teach ourselves how to properly land in the correct position and absorb force to really work towards more longevity in the sport, because there's a lot of demand on the chain. Some of the key characteristics we want to develop with our strength training program: power, strength, endurance, stability, and balance. And like I mentioned, all while withstanding repetitive loading. Because running has such a high injury rate, and the research is really all over the place. They show anywhere from 30 to 70% of runners get injured each and every year. That's why I usually recommend a strength training program, running analysis, running retraining program, so we can do the key things outside of running to make sure we're offsetting that injury risk. Okay, so what does the research tell us in terms of strength training? From a performance standpoint, it's really a no-brainer. We can improve speed, improve time until exhaustion. So if we're looking at getting faster or just improving overall endurance to run longer distances, strength training really supports that. It improves a lot of the neuromuscular characteristics that translate to more efficient, more fluid, and more powerful running. So rate of force development, your timing, your coordination, just overall efficiency, which also bleeds into running economy as well. From an injury prevention standpoint, very interesting. There's been a lot of studies out showing, does strength training prevent injuries? And they've done studies with, okay, we're giving, for example, in fall 2019, New York City Marathon specifically, they gave a group of runners here, I want you to follow this strength training program. Other runners were going to study you as our control group. You're not going to do any kind of strength training. What they found was there was no reduction in the percentage of injuries endured during that marathon. So the people that did the strength training, the people that didn't do the strength training, they pretty much were injured right about the same. What we're finding out is strength training is great at addressing the underlying risk factors. So the things that could potentially increase your risk of injury, whether it's biomechanical things or issues with your running, but we need to combine our strength training with some kind of running retraining. We can't expect strength training to do it all. At some point, we need to look at running form, running mechanics, running more effectively, and really connect those two to see the most or the best long-term results when it comes to injury prevention. I don't really like to even use the word injury prevention since there's no way. The injury rates are so high with running. Usually like to say injury reduction. Let's try to reduce our risk of injury, but at no point can we prevent them from happening altogether. Some important training principles, and like I mentioned before, these are key things that I really want you to pay attention to, because at a certain point, your program needs to change and evolve to fit what you need, whether it's your running mileage, whether it's some aches and pains, whether it's where you are within your training program. First and foremost, specificity is one of the most important principles. The program needs to be specific, not only to the desired end goal. If your goal is to get faster, reduce your likelihood of injury, increase mileage, we need to implement a program that really supports that. And also what specific weak links you suffer from. So we all have imbalances, asymmetries, lack range of motion in certain areas. There's a lot of different things that we typically suffer from as humans, just as we go through our day-to-day life. We complete a lot of the same movements and things. So making sure within that strength training program, it's specific not only to your goals, but your specific needs to improve overall movement quality and performance. Progressive overload, this is something I see a lot of people neglecting. A lot of people are completing the same strength training program and not finding ways to progressively make it harder. You need to at some point, so for example, if you're doing, we'll say a squat, just for simplicity's sake, if you're doing squat and you're doing 2 sets of 10 and you're doing that consistently week after week for months, at a certain point, your body is no longer going to positively adapt to that. It's always good to move through the range of motion, maintain strength, maintain stability, work on posture and those things, but you need to consider, okay, do we need to go from 2 sets of 10 to 2 sets of 12, or is it to 3 sets of 10? Or when I do the squat, instead of doing 1 second down, 1 second up, am I going down 3 seconds and then coming up 1? Am I changing these small variables to progressively increase the demand on the body? Because that's super important from just an overall result standpoint to make sure you continue to see results. With that being said, need to follow a periodized program. What that means is running at certain points of the year, running volume, running mileage is really going to change based on where you are in relation to your goal race. So a lot of people right now, again, in a normal year, not with kind of the current situation as much, but majority of people will be training for some kind of October, potentially November race. So mileage is getting up there as we get into September. So strength training needs to start to back down. We want to make sure that we don't just increase running volume and keep strength training volume high or increase at the same rate, because doing more could increase your risk of some kind of chronic running related injury. So as running mileage starts to increase as you prepare for that goal race, strength training needs to start to back down at some point. Those of you who have been strength training for a long period of time, you can get away with a little bit more in terms of total volume. But those of you that are brand new to strength training, been strength training only within the first year or two, you really need to be smart of not adding too much volume. There are specific times, like more sensitive times throughout the year, where you can be more aggressive with your strength training. So for instance, if you were running a goal race here, middle of October, once you finish that race, running mileage is going to drop down. I'm still going to maintain some mileage, obviously, maybe run some 5Ks, 10Ks, do some things for fun. But at that point, when you're no longer technically building for your goal race, you can be more aggressive with your strength training. You can increase the volume there to build, to address any aches or pains and things, to set you up for January, when you're going to build up your running mileage again, and then your strength training backs down. So periodization is super important, just from a longevity and a sustainability standpoint with running, to make sure we're not setting ourselves up for failure when it comes to just overall having these overall training loads that are too great for the body to recover from. Minimum effective dose. This is something I talked about quite a bit on some of my past webinars. We always think more is better, when in reality, better is better, especially when it comes to these repetitive sports, whether you're running, cycling, swimming, or just overall a triathlete. These just repetitive sports, the volume tends to be pretty high. So we want to, with our strength training program, as we get into that building period when it comes to running mileage, or your training mileage there, to do as much as you need to see the desired results. So for instance, if I have a headache, one Advil gets rid of that headache. Is there really a need for two? One will have less side effects, less risks. So that's kind of the standpoint that you need, or the viewpoint you need when it comes to your strength training during certain parts of your training cycle. What's the smallest amount I can get away with while still seeing those results? Let me see, I got a couple questions here. Let me just look through. Make sure I'm not missing any questions right now. Stress relief, injury-free, stronger, feeling while running. Hope Water Team, awesome. Awesome, guys. All right, so let's see, make sure I get all these out there. All right, so now as we get into the most effective strength training exercises, let's dig into some of these questions any of you have along the way. Just like you did a second ago, in that Q&A, drop a note. Let me know anything you want me to slow down on, explain more, any exercise that you personally struggle with and you want a couple pointers on how to fine tune that. But let's dig into some of the exercises. So we're going to kind of break these down into different focuses here and show you progressions. Reason being, if we're looking at a home strength training program, there's no way for me to know, okay, this person at home has dumbbells, this person has bands, this person has nothing, this person has a stability ball. I wanted to do something that I know everyone could do, which is body weight training, because you can customize that with some kind of resistance or external load, or move through the progression as I have outlined to continue seeing good results. So with this first progression here, we're going to look at a split squat progression. So this is a more knee dominant exercise, the split squat, which means we're going to load directly into that anterior knee, patellar tendon, quad tendon area, which is really important for runners from a shock absorption standpoint. So to start us off here, I'm going to show you kind of a typical progression I like to put a lot of runners through. And this one here, again, completely body weight. So something moving at your pace, you can move through. And I mean, this could take you up to 6 months to really get through, to do well as you move from one exercise to the next, increase sets, increase repetitions, change the tempo, a lot of ways where you can kind of move through this progression here. But just to show you, so on the left side, that video is going, but I'm completely stationary. That's the split squat isometric hold. So typically a position where I like to test a lot of people in the beginning before we get started. I like my runners to have a minimum, or be able to hold that position for a minimum of 1 minute per side. It just gives me a good lens into overall quad strength, lower extremity endurance, and how well they can load and hold any knee pain, any issues from sitting into that position for that period of time. But we really want to achieve about 1 minute per side. So as a test, it's great. Also like to use it as an exercise. So seeing, okay, this person can hold this for 40 seconds per side. So great. We're going to start with 2 to 3 sets of 30 seconds per side, build up strength, build up endurance. Good thing about this split squat position is we're in that staggered stance or stationary lunge. Is we're not just working on strengthening these muscles, we're also working on balance and stability at that deep part of the lunge. So from here, a lot more loads into the knee, into the quad. Need to work on posture, control, maintaining a nice level pelvis as I sit into that position. Knee is hard to see. Knee is actually off the ground there too. So we're lifted about 2-3 inches off the floor. But I like to look at where that front thigh is in relation to the ground. I like to get people just before parallel. Again, we don't need to go parallel or lower to sink into that, to get that knee like just hovering the ground. We want to be up a little bit higher just before parallel. But that is the typical first step I put people through. Test them in that position, and then we'll use that as our first exercise to start to build kind of overall strength, endurance, and resiliency into that lunge position. And often I like stationary positions first. I find a lot of people are so quick to go to lunges, walk-in lunges, reverse lunges, different variations there. But as we add these dynamic exercises, it doesn't give us as much time to really focus on the balance and the stability. If I set up here at the bottom of the split squat and I simply just lift up, I'm setting myself in the right position. I can think about all the components at once rather than stepping back, having to figure things out and hopefully get better as I go along. This almost kind of increases effectiveness from the beginning. So now next exercise, and surprisingly, people would say this is actually easier than that first step, but we're going from isometric to what's called isotonic. So holding a position for a period of time to now moving through the range of motion. So you can see here, setting up in that split squat position, lowering down, always thinking about dropping that back knee down towards the ground and then pushing up from the front leg. I see a lot of people that, even though we're in a stationary position, are thinking lunge, like I'm going to lower by lunging that front knee forward. We want to more so drop straight down into the knees and the hips and then drive straight up. So really good exercise that shifts, again, like 60-70% of the load onto the front leg. We don't necessarily want to push off the back, but we want to use that front leg to create that strength and that power to drive up. With all these exercises, one good thing to look at is position of the foot. I do recommend for a lot of people, I'm not in this video, but to perform this exercise with no shoes on, to look at, okay, what is the foot doing? Are we stabilizing that foot with the ground? Are we supporting the arch? Or is there a lot of rocking and rolling of that foot moving around from an instability standpoint? So it's a good way in a static balance position to really reinforce good stability and control from the foot and some of the small intrinsic muscles down there. So with an exercise like this, doing anywhere from 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions per side. We can change the tempo as well, lower down 1, 2, 3, and then drive up strong. So a lot of different variables that we can change here to make that exercise more challenging. So Betty had a great question. Are these okay if I have the beginning of osteoarthritis in the knee? If you're in those early stages of that, most likely. However, I probably would start you with some kind of bilateral exercise like the squat. So doing actually what's called the sumo squat and sitting down to a chair, coming up, holding a resistance. So a lot of times I see with osteoarthritis that if you're able to do a squat and actually turn the feet out a little bit more, turn the knees out to align with the feet well, it takes a little load off the knees that become a little achy and irritated for some of these knee dominant positions. So I probably would always start with some kind of squat pattern first, and then over a period of time, 1 to 2 months, if you're doing well with that, then I would go into some kind of split squat. But that's really person specific. So it really depends on kind of where you are right now in terms of pain. Next exercise in the progression, one of my favorites, rear foot elevated split squat. So now you can see, only thing we change here, the motion, the position is exactly the same, but we just kick that back leg up on this is on a box. You can do it on a couch or a chair at home. First step, second step in the staircase. It doesn't really matter as long as that back foot is elevated. Obviously, the higher that back leg is, the more range of motion that knee is going to have to go through, greater stretch through that back leg as well. So I think it's one of the good things about some of these single leg type or split stance exercises is, yes, we're building strength, endurance, stability, but there's also a degree of flexibility involved as well. So with this one, a little bit harder from a balance standpoint. There's more weight, typically like 70-80% of the weight now on the front leg. So we're loading that to a greater degree. So we went from split squat hold, more of an equal contribution from the front and back leg, Regular split squat, 60, 70% onto that front leg. Rear foot elevated split squat, 70, 80% on that front leg. So this is just through this progression, how we're making things a little bit harder on that quad and knee joints. But same thing in terms of sets and repetitions, anywhere from 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions. I know people are very different when it comes to this one. I also have people at some point, usually early on, holding a PVC pipe, a broomstick, something just to assist balance on this one, because it can get a little bit tricky to get that full range of motion to maintain your balance. So sometimes using some kind of external support just to make sure you're sitting in the right position can be helpful. But obviously you can even see there a couple dumbbells on the ground. All of these exercises, if you have dumbbells at home, no reason you can't hold a dumbbell in each hand, load them up, make them harder if you need to, rather than going up in repetitions, go up in resistance. Okay, let me just see. Okay, great question. So Connie says, mine is a foot issue, as with these, you are more on your toes. So that's a great, I wish I put that in there, but I didn't. So I don't know how I can explain this. So if you look at, doesn't really go, no way to show it with the video. So if you, instead of putting, it's usually the back foot that's the issue on some of these lunge, stationary lunge variations. So if we look at, we'll look at this one on, pause this video here. So we look at the video on the right side of the screen. I'm down in the low position of that split squat. Instead of digging the toes into the ground there, what I actually would recommend, if your toes are an issue, which I see a lot of people, bunions, previous surgeries, neuromas, those types of things. If I actually turn, put my foot flat on the wall, so instead of having my toe into the ground, my foot is flat onto the wall. So that foot is straight down here rather than extending into the toes. Back foot is up on the wall. And then my other front leg is forward as I hold that split squat position. It's a way to take stress off the toes. By taking stress off the toes in that position, the exercise becomes a little bit harder. But the people that I've had with previous foot issues that cannot extend well into the toes like that, it's a great modification to continue to do a lot of these variations. The rear foot elevated split squat would be good. Putting pressure on the top of the foot, you can kind of change your ankle position to adjust for that, but obviously a hard variation at the same point. But sometimes just putting that back foot right up on the wall is a good start. So Chris had a great question. I do the split squat iso hold barefoot now. I was thinking about putting shoes on for it. I personally would do most things barefoot. I think that's more advantageous, especially for that front leg and back leg. If you don't have any toe issues, good flexibility in the great toe and the toes, we want that to run. We need that toe extension as we go and push off. But I think if you're able to go without shoes, just to be able to connect with the floor, a lot of our shoes now, I mean, the stack height is so high, they're so built up, there's cushion and things in them. But if you can get into, again, go barefoot with some kind of minimalist shoe or zero drop shoe or something where you connect more with the ground, I would recommend that as opposed to wearing some kind of shoe, and especially some kind of running shoe with these. So now as we move on here, step ups. So step ups, hands down, I think one of the best exercises for runners. One of my favorite exercises that if you work with me, we're doing quite a few step ups within the program, doing them every single week, sometimes multiple days, different variations, just because we're getting truly onto a single leg now. So instead of it being a knee dominant movement, and we're gonna show some hip dominant in a second, this is more of, I would say, fits in kind of that hybrid category. We're using more knee, hip equally when it comes to muscles to kind of power up through this movement. So with the step up here, height really matters. And I think one thing that's important when it comes to running is understanding running is a very limited range of motion sport. We don't need to use the highest step or highest box to perform a step up when we're pushing off that back leg and it's hard to balance and control. We want something lower that we can control our position on, maintain levelness throughout the pelvis, and then align the leg, stabilize the foot. So even this box that I'm doing it on, this is just something I had, actually it was like a little end table type thing that was solid that I just flipped over for the video. But this is kind of the higher end of the range I would go for step ups. So you can see if I go back. So you can see here, my knee is just below my hip. We don't want to get to a point where that knee is level with, or that knee is higher than. That's too high of a step up as it relates to running. We want lower range of motion, and we want to build up either repetitions or a harder variation, like more resistance or like overhead step up, like I'll show you in a second. But when it comes to step up, you're always thinking about alignment of that leg. A lot of times as you drive up and pull from that top leg, the knee really starts to waver in and out. So we want to stabilize that. A lot of the stability in the lower limb comes from the foot and the hip. So we need to stabilize, make sure we're maintaining a good position, drive up, control into that single leg stance, and then nice and easy on the way down. So on these, you can see just the emphasis on control on the lowering, taking a couple seconds to come back down. You tend to feel that knee position. At home, I recommend for a lot of people starting on the first step, moving to the second step, really owning the position through a limited range of motion first. Shoes off. I know Kristen asked that question a second ago with the split squats. Shoes off, see what the foot is doing. You'll see that tendency for the foot to roll and that big toe to lift up. We really want to stabilize there, make sure either we're not collapsing into the arch or we're rolling and that big toe is coming up, since the majority of our stability comes from that big toe and medial arch. The same thing with the split squats, anywhere from 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions per side. You can increase the repetitions, you can change the tempo, a lot of different ways you can make this harder. Not many instances I would go higher than this to make it harder. If anything, I probably would hold something in my hand, something you have in your house. If you have dumbbells or something, you can load it up and make it a little bit more challenging. The next step here, overhead step up. So you can see motion's exactly the same, not much changes. Now I'm just holding the arms up overhead. Let me rewind a second. So look what I'm doing here. When it comes to the core, and this is important, I crunch down a little bit and try to engage my abs to pull my rib cage down. So watch your arms come down. Biggest thing is when you lift your arms up overhead, there's a tendency for the back to arch. So we want to, as much as possible, maintain strength, stability throughout that core, engage that area. So as the arms lift up overhead, I'm not opening up, I'm engaged, and I'm staying nice and tall. What happens when you raise up arms up overhead? Yes, the back goes into extension. You start to arch the back. Also increases the body's center of mass. So it makes balance and stability a little bit harder. So even though you're looking at this like, okay, regular step up with arms up overhead, how much different can that be? Surprisingly, it's a bit more challenging to have to stabilize and control your position. And why I like this for at home is you can hold something in your hands, whether it's a textbook, a water, jug of water, something to have to hold up there, because that instability of something overhead really makes balance a little bit more challenging, that you then have to really focus on. So let me see, question. Austin's buddy, I've done these on using a park bench. Perfect. Just making sure you're not going too high, but these exercises you can do anywhere and everywhere, which is great. I mean, if you don't have stairs, some people don't have stairs in their house. Doing it on the sidewalk, on the curb, buying a cinder block. Cinder blocks are great for step ups, and a lot of these strength training movements at home only cost a few bucks. So now, as we change, like I mentioned, knee dominant, more of a hybrid with the step up, and then we have hip dominant exercises. So single leg hip hinge patterns, we're looking more so at stability and strength around the hip joint, and then also kind of control and stability at the core to make sure we're properly aligned and we're not opening up and rotating. Standing airplane, you were going to rotate, and I'll show you that in a second to increase the challenge. But when it comes to single leg hip hinge, great exercise that more posterior chain focus. So we're looking at calf, hamstring, glute, spinal erectors, a lot of these muscles that are on the back side of the body, which most runners tend to be a little bit deficient and weak in. In this one, again, a lot more challenging when it comes to balancing, I find, for people when you're doing these hip dominant exercises. So all I want to do in this motion here, keep my body square facing forward or towards the ground. I don't want to, as I lower down, turn and rotate and open up. I'm going to hinge through the hips, back leg, body, arms, all of that kind of move as one. So you can see my body and my back leg are almost connected. You're moving as a unit as you hinge throughout the hip joint. As you get down to the bottom, there's a bit of a hamstring stretch. So something that's beneficial for those of you that are tight through the hamstring, some of those posterior chain muscles. We're getting that eccentric contraction. That hamstring is lengthening as it's lowering you down into the hip hinge. And then as I come up, really want to focus on actually driving the hips forward to stand up. It's not a back extension exercise. It's a hip exercise and a hip extension movement. So think of more of a upright hip bridge, that same motion of driving the hips forward to get the hips up into the air. That's the same thought process here. So you get that eccentric lengthening of the hamstring, controlling through that, and then you get the glute activation, glute strength, and stability there as well. So really good exercise, especially those of you that are starting to incorporate any kind of speed work. Hamstrings typically take a beating the faster you run. The more that hamstring has to decelerate the limb as it kind of swings through before your foot strikes the ground again. So this is where some of these posterior chain exercises come in, and typically an area most people are deficient. So definitely would have that balance between quad and hamstring. Quads are always going to be a stronger muscle group. We don't need to be completely balanced 1-to-1, but typically it's like a 3-to-2 ratio quadriceps to hamstring that we want to achieve as much as possible. Now, on the next exercise, this is a friend in PT in Nashville, did a lot of videos and things with while I lived down there. This is the standing airplane, a surprisingly challenging exercise. He does it pretty well in this. I do recommend shoes off for this one, as opposed to running shoes. So I don't want to give you any false sense of stability. You can see what that foot is doing. But like I mentioned before, we know running is a predictable pattern, always moving forward. So we can still challenge a lot of these same muscles that are relative: glute, hamstring, stabilizers, core, but at the same point, moving in this transverse or rotational motion will help us break out of that sagittal plane and add more of that rotational stress on the hip joint specifically, to target those muscles like the glute medius, piriformis, hip external rotators. Again, some people tend to have these chronic issues with those muscles. But at the same time, this is a good one to really challenge the foot and the lower leg. As you're in that hip hinge position, you obviously have to balance, but as you start to rotate that direction, you need to make sure that foot stays grounded, the big toe is pushing down into the ground, and you're not rolling and rocking around the foot. So a lot of the runners that I work with that are suffering from plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendonitis, post-tib tendonitis, or any of these tendinopathies, this is an exercise that we actually will implement a lot to look at stability of the foot and the lower leg. But from a strengthening and stabilizing standpoint, it's pretty hip, hamstring, glute focused for those of you that are not doing any kind of hip dominant exercises. Biggest thing to understand about the difference between these two is the degree of motion. You can see how far I'm going down here. I'm getting down just that, if not short of 90 degrees at the hip. Here, he's about 45 degrees. So doing the airplane in that deeper depth of the single leg hip hinge would be super challenging. Usually we don't need to get that far into that position. So it's a different range of motion we're challenging with these. But with both of them, anywhere 2 to 3 sets, typically exercises that I like to do as part of my dynamic warm-up to prep for running. From a strength training standpoint, you can increase the repetitions a little bit more to get that strength and endurance challenge. 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions per side, and just really focusing on controlling and owning your position. Now, the calf is one of the most important areas when it comes to running, and probably the top one, to be honest with you. Can't be neglected. If we think of the muscles that are resisting kind of the force of the body weight coming down into the ground, and then just that propulsion component of needing to push off on each step, that's where the calf comes in and really plays a big role. So a couple different ways we can target the calf, and I'll show you here: straight leg variations and bent leg variations. It's very important to kind of alternate between the two. When it comes to the straight leg variation, so if you look here, sorry, a little bit dark this that video, but just regular bilateral calf raises, leaning against the wall, not focusing on balance or stability or doing it out in space necessarily, but just strengthening, building strength and endurance at the calf. So driving up as high as I can, keeping equal pressure on all toes. One thing you tend to see with calf raises when people have kind of an imbalance at the lower leg is they're going to lift up, but they're going to shift and roll their ankles. They're going to roll their ankles out, and they're going to shift to the outside towards that small toe. So we want to keep the feet as neutral as possible as we go through these calf raise variations, and not compensate by rolling to the outside of the foot. So very important from a stability and control standpoint down there with those of you with some kind of lower leg issues or foot issues, but just to maintain a good position as you do the calf raise. Ways we can make the standard calf raise harder, which I don't really do a lot of standard calf raises. Like I mentioned, running is such a single leg sport. We want to get to the single leg exercises as quickly as possible because it's more specific. But we can add a deficit, which means we're just going on a stair, using a plate, a textbook, anything to add more range of motion. So as you can see, as I sink down there into what's called ankle dorsiflexion, I'm going into a slight stretch position at the ankle and the calf. This is very important when it comes to running because the ankle, the great toe, the ankle, in the hip into extension or that push off motion are the three ranges of motion where we actually challenge that lower extremity through the greatest amount of motion that's kind of relative to that joint. So we want to make sure we have enough ankle dorsiflexion. So this is one, if you are stiff, you're a little bit tight in the ankle, you can build strength and endurance while also trying to promote good flexibility and good mobility at the ankle and the calf. Okay. And these anywhere from 10 to 25 repetitions. I mean, usually bilateral calf raises for runners typically aren't that hard. I just wanted to make sure I didn't skip any steps here when showing you some of these variations. Now, next, ideally we want to get to some kind of single leg calf raise. Biggest thing here in that single leg plyometric-like activity of running, jumping, landing, loading into a single leg, pushing off on a single leg. I find a lot of people that with lingering issues, plantar fascia, Achilles issues that continue to do regular two-footed or bilateral calf raises, but never take the step to single leg and then expect, okay, I'm going to go out in there and run even though it's not painful, and realize, okay, it's not working well. The Achilles has flared up, the plantar fascia has flared up because you really need to take the next step to bridge the gap to the demands of the sport. So that's where the single leg variations come in. So you can see Chris here again, leaning against the wall as I showed before in the past two, as high as you can, nice and high up on, raising the heel up off the ground and then slowly lowering down the heel to the floor. Really focusing on keeping that foot neutral, equal pressure on all toes, the ball of the foot, and not rolling, lifting that big toe up or rolling to the outside of the foot is important on this one. And then same thing as before, just simply adding that deficit, more range of motion. So we have single leg now, completely single leg. We have more range of motion. This is a tricky exercise to get through. If you're curious of, do I have enough calf strength? I haven't been doing any calf raises or anything. You typically want, where are we? This single leg one here is one I actually do as a initial assessment or evaluation to see how strong people are. Do they have the necessary endurance of the calf? Should be able to do 25 single leg calf raises per side. I notice a lot of people get about 15, 16, start to feel and tons of soreness, cramping sensation, fatigue, or can't complete all 25. Should be able to do 25 single leg calf raises per side. That's the minimum you should shoot for. From a testing standpoint, you don't need to train that every day in your strength training program. But as you do your strength training program, any of these variations, I usually go in the single leg ones, typically from 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 15 repetitions per side. Because we're layering in multiple sets rather than needing to go so high on the repetitions, or the bilateral ones. Those ones I tend to go a little bit higher on repetitions. I could actually go up to 25 repetitions depending on the need. But 4 exercises to progress through when it comes to strengthening the calf in the straight knee position, because this is strengthening the outermost gastrocnemius muscle, as opposed to, I'm going to show you right now, that deeper soleus muscle, which is why we have these soleus wall sit variations. It's actually the soleus muscle in the calf, not the outermost one, the gastroc muscle, the slightly deeper soleus muscle, which endures more stress as you run, because running is usually done in more of a knee bent position. So it's that soleus muscle that, due to anatomy, is stressed to a greater degree. So these variations are typically ones most people don't know about. I don't see a lot of people. Sometimes in the gym, I'll see people doing that bent knee calf raise machine where they're sitting, or the seated calf raise machine, and they're going through calf raises. That's great. But at home with no resistance, these are great variations to really challenge your body weight, challenge the soleus muscle against your body weight to build strength and endurance, because this is typically where most people are hiding that underlying weakness. So just to see, and like I mentioned, to get the soleus muscle, the knee has to be bent as you perform the calf raise. So on the first one, soleus wall sit, exactly as it sounds, sitting in a wall sit position, just short of 90 degrees at the knees, and then lifting the heels up off the ground. Surprisingly challenging and shaky exercise at first for a lot of people. I see people either feel like quads get real shaky, calves get real shaky, but want to build people up typically to be able to hold that for about 60 seconds, and doing that about 2 to 3 sets. Usually it doesn't take people a long time to achieve that, but I like to get to, like I mentioned, a lot of the single leg variations. So we have the single leg alternating soleus wall sit, same position. Feet are completely together right now because it's harder from a stability standpoint to not rock over when the feet are wide. So elbows dig into the wall, feet go together, and then I'm holding that same position, obviously a little bit higher on this one because it's harder. I'm trying to keep my heel up the same height off the ground and not collapse that heel down. So I'm using that single-sided soleus muscle deeper in the calf to provide that strength and endurance to hold my position. Same thing, you can go 2 to 3 sets, 30 to 60 seconds. You can go a number of repetitions if you do 8 times per side, or you can start to build up more time. We're going to hold on the right leg for 10 seconds, hold the left leg for 10 seconds, or longer time, shorter time, whatever you need to make that challenging for yourself. But these 2 exercises are something I would 100% consider. Are you doing any kind of bent leg, bent knee calf raises? If you're not, start over here with the soleus ball sit and move on. If you are somehow, I would kind of jump into that single leg variation. But these are probably 2 of the most important things I would consider from this webinar today. Okay, so from a core standpoint, core training for running is very simple. We want to promote stability as much as possible. A lot of times, if we just look at the difference between strength and stability, strengthening the core is we're using these muscles to move the spine throughout its range of motion, whether we're holding weights or we're doing these lateral dips, we're doing crunches, sit-ups, or we're doing Supermans. That's a strengthening exercise. Those are still needed to some degree, and I program those depending on the needs of the runner. But stability is what really translates to efficiency of movement. So we know as we run, we have a small degree of rotation. That body is going to rotate a small amount from side to side. And by no means do we want to be flying around here, because that's going to increase the load as we land and strike the ground. So we want these muscles around the core to contract, to stabilize, to really own a good position between the pelvis, the spine, and the rib cage. A lot of times, a lot of the issues that I see with most runners is lack of stability in these areas. Their knee collapses in, pelvis is dropping. These are ways that you'll see typical compensations, which could potentially lead to injury, but also leads to less efficient movement. So just to run through a couple, again, 4 specific core exercises, and these are really the key things that most people need. There are a couple other additional things you might want to add into the program, but to me, these are the non-negotiables when it comes to core training. First one, hip bridge. So glute, hamstring, posterior chain strength, but primarily glute strength, getting up into extension. So you can see here, toes are lifted, heels are dug into the ground. I tend to recommend that because I've seen you can feel or connect with the glutes a little bit more. But as long as the feet are close to the body, the hips are lifted up, and you're all the way in extension. A lot of times I see people who lack extension. You look at them as they lift the hips up there, and the hips aren't fully up. So we think, okay, as this person pushes off as they run, are they actually properly propelling the body and be able to push off into extension? So this really helps promote that hip extension. So very simple variation here. I don't really have people perform a lot of traditional hip bridges. We'll do it as a starting point depending on where they're at, their injury history, 30 to 60 seconds max, not something we need to sit in and do all day, because most runners can do this for a long period of time. But we want to get into some of these single leg variations, because we want to really reinforce single-sided single leg glute strength, and also control the pelvis, control the spine. So as I lift up a leg and introduce this marching motion here, there's a tendency for the pelvis to drop and the hips to drop. We want to maintain that full hip extension, own the position at the pelvis in the core, so there's no shift or rocking from side to side. We can also, if I wanted to, add a marching motion with the arms in there, just to get that kind of reciprocal motion that as you run. But you can see there, I'm actually putting my hands over my rib cage. I'm trying to monitor that because I don't want my back to arch to hold me up. I want my hip, so I'm trying to engage my abs, monitor that position at the ribs, and get the hip extension. With something like that, and most of these, anywhere from hip bridges, 30 to 60 seconds, multiple sets, or hip bridge or marching, anywhere from 8 to 15 per side, same thing, multiple sets. Now, the dead bug is probably one of the best exercises, what we call anti-extension core stability. We're using these muscles around the core, oblique, transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis, deep stabilizers to make sure we're not going into extension. We talked about that earlier with the overhead step up, not extending the spine. So we want to maintain good posture, and it really comes from this abdominal midsection area. So as you're engaging the core here, the arm moves up, opposite arm, opposite leg move away. There's a tendency to get into that extended position. All the muscles around the midsection need to fire, to stabilize the spine, to prevent yourself from arching your back. So although a very easy exercise, several things have to go right to maintain your position. Because if you kind of continue to monitor, put the hand under the lower back to see, okay, am I losing my position? That's where you know if you're doing it correctly or incorrectly. And obviously, the greater the arm and leg reach away, the harder the exercise can be. So if you need to, learning this exercise, shorten the range of motion with the arm and the leg to get it down, not to challenge the spine as much. That's a good starting point. And then reach and increase more range of motion as you go. Next step here is the bent legs lowering exercise. So bent legs lowering is focusing on the same thing. We're engaging these muscles around the core to stabilize the spine. We're letting both legs go away this time because that creates a tendency for the pelvis to roll with the legs for the back to arch. So we're trying to stabilize the core, let those legs slowly lift away, and then bring it back without the spine changing its position. So really good one, really challenging one. You can make this harder or easier depending on how high or how low you bring the legs. If you bring the legs up towards more of a 45-degree angle at the end, it'll be a little bit easier. Your back doesn't have the tendency to arch as much. But as you go down, we want you to get to a point where those heels are almost scraping the ground and you're owning that position around the core because nothing's changing. One question I've had from some people recently is, does my back need to stay flat on the ground? I think it's something we always take things into extremes sometimes and say, oh, flatten your back on the ground. Technically, our lumbar spine has a slight lordotic curve to it. So we want to be able to maintain that lordotic curve without going into more extension or more of an arched position. So it's okay if you have a slight arch at your lower back, that's natural, but we don't want to go further into that position. We want to maintain that position rather than lose it. But by no means you need to be completely flat on the ground with your lower back because that's then reversing the natural curve. So now, next one here, side planks fit into that what's called anti-lateral flexion. Core stability. So standard side planks, really important as a starting point for people to make sure we're building strength and stability. Some of these lateral muscles, obliques, quadratus lumborum, these muscles that tie together the outside pelvis, spine, and rib cage, because that which creates a lot of control throughout the pelvis that's then stabilize the leg. But majority of runners, I find typically do fairly well here. We want to be able to get up to a minimum of about a minute per side. And then once we can do that, get into the single leg variation. So whether we're lifting and holding for a period of time or lift lower, and completing repetitions. This is also a test that I use in my kind of initial test for runners. We should be able to do a minimum of 20 seconds per side. That's kind of what the research shows that we want, because this is testing core strength and stability, but also hip abductor strength. So if you think what's happening, that bottom hip is having to drive that leg and that foot down into the ground. So we're not just testing the core anymore. We're actually targeting that lateral hip, glute medius, glute minimus muscles, which are super important for running. Let me see if I move this out of the way. All right, so now, last one here is what's called the powerlift press. We know that, and kind of I guess the parents on the dog there, we know that there is a degree of rotation as we run, but we also want to strengthen some of those muscles, work on stability of the spine to prevent excess rotation. So as you can see with this variation, I'm kneeling. It's a tall kneeling powerlift press. Kneeling, hips engage, core engage. I'm nice and tall. My arms are out. I'm actually driving and pushing into the wall. I'm trying to set up in the right position where I'm not having to turn. It's lined up right down the center of my body, and I'm staying nice and vertical as I do it, okay? So engaging on both sides to work those core rotators to prevent rotation rather than create rotation. And then a simple way that we can progress that is by going into that half kneeling position. A lot of times if you're at a gym, if you have TheraBands or cables at home, this is a good exercise that you can actually do with cables or bands if they're looped around something. But now in this half kneeling position, we're in a lunge position. We're working on stability, balance, control. So we're adding in stability from the ground up to be able to stabilize the hips, the core, and then we're getting those core rotators at the same time. But typically on this one, holding for repetitions, anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds, holding that and doing multiple sets. You can hold for 5 seconds, rest, 5 seconds, rest, or just go 30 to 60 seconds in hold. So those are pretty much the main strength training exercises. The question is, are there other components? And there always are. We could probably spend 10 hours talking about everything that should fit within a strength training program. It's not just all about building strength. Diaphragmatic breathing, being able to properly stabilize the core and use the diaphragm at the same time, something I typically put in for a lot of runners. Running retraining drills, like I mentioned before, we need to combine strength training and a running analysis, combine those things together to really make sure, again, if we're going to reduce the risk of injury, we're not just going to get stronger and do these exercises, we're going to figure out what specific areas of our running that we need to improve. And we're going to kind of marry those two together, add some running retraining drills in, maybe add some slow motion marching to the metronome, specific drills to improve hip extension, position of the foot strike. There's a lot of things that we tie into these strength training programs to make more specific. Skipping locomotion drills from a kind of a low-level basic plyometric standpoint, a dynamic warm-up standpoint, very specific. You can see the woman here on the left side of your screen doing some kind of power skip. But a lot of runners, we work on low skips, A skips, B skips, power skips. It really helps reinforce that fluidity of running mechanics. Nice, quick, powerful push-offs and foot strikes that translate to and better just overall running mechanics. Plyometrics. At some point, a lot of these exercises can be progressed to some kind of jumping movement, whether we're doing squat jumps, we're doing split jumps or lunge jumps, bounds, line hops. Very good for at-home strength training because you don't need any equipment, and you can kind of monitor, okay, how high am I getting? How far am I jumping, to work on that stiffness of what's called the musculotendinous unit, the muscle and the tendon, because that's what translates to speed, to power, and also to running economy at the same time. Upper body strength and posture, I always have upper body in every single program. Usually good, especially from a postural standpoint, opening up shoulders, properly engaged, core, everything firing together to connect the pieces to make sure we're maintaining good form. Again, it's great to be a strong runner lower body wise, but if you're falling apart up here, that's only going to make things harder. Okay, so really making sure we're still focusing on some kind of upper body strength training. And then joint mobility and range of motion, like I mentioned before, big toe, ankle, hip into extension are typically the main areas from a running standpoint. But obviously, some of your goals looking at the why behind these. Again, it's not just all about running, right? We want healthy range of motion. We want to continue to chase our kids, our grandkids around as we're 80, 90 years old, to be active and to be healthy. So adding mobility drills and things into the mix to make sure we're preserving or improving joint ranges of motion is something we mix in. Sometimes as rest periods, we'll do a split squat, we'll do a push-up, let's do a hip flexor stretch. We'll add that in as a quick rest just to get a little bit more from the program, but also rest in the process. And then lastly, injury specific. So every strength training program needs to take into consideration your previous injury history. What are those things you suffered from the past? What are those things that continue to be an issue, that they ache or they cause pain from time to time? Or are you actively injured? Essentially, strength training is just rehab to a degree, but just at a different end of the spectrum. Now it's a little bit more performance focused, but I think if you incorporate the proper strength training program, you can tie all these things together. Running mechanics, past injury history, current aches and pains, performance goals, all of that stuff can fit together into one cohesive program. So for long-term results, some of the key things, and we went over some of the principles, some of the key exercises, demands of running, so you understand that. Need to make sure you're individualizing your program as much as possible. I think 100% doing the exercise I laid out here today can be a good first step. But what are underlying imbalances? What are the specific things you need to improve in terms of running form? Figuring that stuff out, condensing your program to what's important will only help you take off in the months and years to come. Periodization, understanding where you are in relation to your running. Again, those of you who might be running an October race, whether it's virtual or in person somewhere, is now the best time to add strength training? Maybe not. Maybe you want to wait a month till you finish that goal race and then you dive deep into that. But really respecting where you are with your mileage, following a periodized program, and making running the priority if that's where the kind of the main goals are. Like I mentioned, respecting your running mileage, properly manipulating the program, sets, repetitions, tempo, rest periods, a lot of different ways that we can make things harder or easier depending on what you need. So changing these variables as you go along. We're not just following the same program month after month. I mean, that'll provide limited results after a period of time. What things can we adjust? Can we change the exercise variation? Can we change the tempo of the movement? Can we jump? Can we do a squat jump instead of a squat because we're in the off season, because I'm looking to improve power? A lot of things we can manipulate to continue seeing results. And then as always, adjusting for those niggles, aches and pains and things along the way. No way to prevent injury 100%. A lot of people in the registration mentioned, I want to prevent injury. It's impossible, to be honest with you. Running, you need to really look at your running program first and foremost. You're following a proper running program, but you can still address some of those risk factors and underlying things with your strength training. At some point, something's going to happen. But I think if you do strength training right, the severity of that injury will be drastically less. And that's the key thing. So hopefully that injury that might have set you back, where you actually went to the doc and need to take some time off, maybe it's adjusting your strength training program, reducing your mileage, calms down, and you get back to it, right? I think that's the beauty of a good strength training program. So as we wrap up here, before we get into the raffle, I'm going to do one quick quiz. See how well you guys are paying attention. We're right about end of time here. I just want to see what you got from the webinar today. So I have a couple questions for you. I'm sorry for those of you who cannot see this. I know sometimes there's an issue with Zoom and not showing the quiz or the polls to a lot of people. Question 1, strength training should follow a periodized approach to fit properly alongside your running. Is that true or false? 2, due to the lack of resistance, the squat is better replaced by the what in order to increase the challenge and specificity of running. I don't think I said specifically, but hopefully just by saying the name of the exercise, I led you there. 3, the calf complex is best targeted by, is it performing a straight knee calf raise variation, bent knee calf raise variation? It's too hard to target or only while running. And then 4, core blank is the most applicable for runners. Is it core strength, core stability, core mobility, or core activation? Take a second here. Oh, just a heads up. Number 3 is multiple choice. There's actually 2 answers to number 3. So those of you who said the better answer, add that other answer in there. We're going to wait till about 80% complete here. I'm going to get into enter names into that raffle. If anyone has any questions now, running related, strength training related, finish the poll, add a question to that Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to that in a second. Let's give another 20 seconds or so. We got about half completed. I put a few people to sleep today, but that's okay. 71% completed, 80%. All right, 5 seconds. Last few people to add in a poll here. So far, so good on the answers. All right, I can end the poll here. All right, guys, just to show you real quickly. Question 1, true. Strength training follow a periodized program, just as running should. Due to lack of external resistance, squat goes to split squat and those variations of the split squat. Calf complex is best targeted by bent knee calf raises and straight knee calf raises, but the bent knee calf raise is that top one, but multiple choice. So there were 2 answers to that. Core stability is the most applicable for runners. All right, guys, I don't want to take up too much of your time. We're a couple minutes over right now. So to enter into the raffle, I'm raffling off 1 free month in the Healthy Running Program for 2 people. I decided to do 2 today. Just finished up with a couple running clients this week. So figure with the additional spot, might as well add someone in and see if I can help someone else out. So what the Healthy Running Program includes is going to be 1 complete month, regardless of whether you're in person or remote. This program can work regardless of location. Running analysis, movement assessment, custom 1-month program. So we're going to work on running mechanics, strength training, injury prevention, and really help guide you throughout that process, make some adjustments, make some tweaks. Injury, if you have an injury history or currently have an injury, also a good program to go through. So if you're interested in entering the raffle, 1 free month, yes, and it's a win it, no, you're all set. Let's see. And I'll use, so what this does is this poll actually tells me the people that responded which way. So tomorrow by 11 a.m., make sure you check your email. You'll get an email with who the winner of the raffle is with the webinar replay. That's when I'll announce. If you win, expect a response back, and we'll set up that initial consultation to figure out exactly how we can customize this program to you. I'm gonna wait 1 second. 1 person who didn't vote. That's the person I put to sleep tonight. All right, perfect. Okay, guys, so I just want to say thank you. Like I mentioned, webinar replay, raffle winner tomorrow at 11 a.m. Check your spam folder. If you don't see that by 11:10 Eastern time, It should be in your spam folder. If by chance you don't get it, had someone last time that didn't get it, even though it said it was sent on my end, shoot me an email, let me know, and I'll send that over to you. Any questions about anything else related to this, I'm going to stick around for about 10 minutes right now for a Q&A. If you have any specific questions that you feel like, hey, I want to ask you personally, let's set up a call, phone, Zoom, whatever it is to talk about that. But if it's something that you feel like we can discuss in the Q&A, let's do that right now. So thank you to those of you who sat through this. We're a couple minutes over, so I understand if you have to go on this Thursday evening. Those of you that have questions, I'll start answering some of those questions now. Looks like we have quite a few here at the bottom already. So we'll dig into those for the next few minutes or so and get to them. Awesome. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you. All right. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to dig into a couple questions. Feel free. Anything you're thinking about, questions, confusion, anything I can clarify, add that into the Q&A below. So first question from Richard, how to strengthen weak glutes and not suffer from muscle weakness? Biggest thing I think is testing first and foremost. So I showed a couple things that would be good to use as tests. The single leg side plank should be able to do 20 seconds per side. It tests the glute medius and minimus, those lateral glute muscles, and then some kind of single leg hip bridge. So like we showed the hip bridge with marching in the demo there, that is a good exercise to work on single leg hip strength, glute maximus. So doing both of those for max time, seeing, okay, where am I weak? Sometimes it's surprising. A lot of people say I'm weak here, but we don't actually quantify that. So figuring out, okay, can only hold 8 seconds per side on the single leg hip lift. On the single leg hip bridge, it's 5 seconds on the left, 43 seconds on the right. It kind of narrows the focus, but then those same exercises that we covered will be good to address those. A lot of times there's other little things you want to add in there, different hip bridge variations, different band exercises potentially to target and tease out those things. But definitely making sure you're identifying that weakness first and foremost. Jennifer, any exercises from today for strengthen iliacus muscles? Not specifically, technically from today. I would do variations of things we did today. So for instance, the hip bridge with marching I showed, if you have a mini band or one of those loops and you put that around the feet, as you march and bring one leg up at a time, it's resisting the hip flexors. That will strengthen the iliacus. Other exercises, standing, band around the feet. If you stand and go into single leg balance, bring one leg up so the knee is level with the hip and you hold, it'll strengthen the iliacus. There's a lot of good variations of a lot of those bridging exercises that I would do. I think what I'm going to do, I'll send you a couple of those actually, because I think those will be, that's really helpful, especially I think you mentioned something like that on the last webinar as well, the iliacus area, but I would definitely test that from a strength and endurance standpoint, see, okay, how weak am I on that side? Am I weak? But usually I see a lot of runners are weak in the hip flexors. It tends to be neglected. So Richard asked, how much time should we dedicate to strength and stretching? How many times per week? Stretching just depends on you. Do you need to stretch technically? No. To be a better runner, technically you don't. Like I mentioned, big toe, ankle, hip extension, 3 things, toe extension, ankle dorsiflexion, hip extension. Those are the motions that you need to properly go through the running cycle. If you're lacking there, you need to be working on those from a mobility standpoint. So if that's the case, if you lack in one of those every day, twice a day, I tell people, some of these areas, it's just getting on them consistently. We think, okay, doing something twice a week is going to lead to the results. I say, hey, if it's important, if it's preventing proper mechanics while you run, do it every single day, do it multiple times a day, do it as you brush your teeth, do it when you get up in the morning. From a strengthening standpoint, 1 session per week will help you maintain your current level of strength. 2 should help you build or increase. Going back to that periodized model, as people are in their off season, I have runners that are anywhere between, they really switch their focus anywhere from 2 strength training days to 4 strength training days a week. 4 is a little bit extreme when it comes to running. 2, 3 is acceptable, I think, and that's kind of the average. As you get higher in your mileage, 1 strength training day is typically enough, but I still have people incorporate some of these other exercises in there, some of the basic activation, bridging exercises, band exercises, core stability exercises. We still do some stuff on other days, but it's not really a full strength training session. All right, Scott, great one. I get cramping while single leg hip bridges. So easy sign there, either could be a couple things. Tightness in the hip flexors, that's preventing the hips from getting all the way up into extension, which would cause more stress on that hamstring muscle group. That's one thing from a flexibility range of motion standpoint. Second thing is some kind of glute weakness, glute inhibition. The glutes are the prime muscles that are going to hold the hips up into extension. If you're weak in the glutes, the hamstrings are going to then have to work a lot harder, and they're almost a secondary hip extension, hip extensor muscle. So I see a lot of people with cramping in the hamstring as they do single leg variations. With that, what I would do is take a step back, and it's hard without knowing exactly what you're doing right now with your exercises, taking a step back, adding other hip activation exercises in there to properly engage the glute, and then doing more simple glute exercises on two legs, feeling the glutes, activating properly, getting all the way up into the bridge position, maybe adding hip flexor stretching if you need it, and then slowly adding a single leg component. So maybe not lifting and holding that single leg for time. You might only do the marching exercise we did earlier, but lifting for a second, lower. Lift for a second, lower, and slowly start to build up strength on that side. Might be one side, might be both. But usually it's typically one side that's a little bit weaker. That's one of the things I like to test with a single leg hip bridge. See, okay, I can hold this 3 seconds before the left side cramps. Right side, I can hold 23 seconds. Okay, we need to really isolate that left side to balance out from side to side rather than just continuing to do things on both sides. Awesome. Any other questions here? So that's the last question asked in the Q&A. A couple other questions here, and I'll probably answer 2 more. A few people asked about, let's see, knee strength, avoid osteoarthritis. I have a bad knee. I can run with a knee brace or leg strength exercises to build and support the knees, how to strengthen areas that support the knees. Some of those split squat variations, step up exercises, those are great to strengthen the knees. The knees, we need to really think about joints above and below. We want good ankle dorsiflexion. That's important, and it really alters our mechanics. If we're tight in the ankles, calf or the ankle is tight, that will affect the knee and how that knee moves throughout the range of motion. So that's very important. Also, the foot, the ankle, and the hip from a stabilization standpoint, those areas provide the control. So you see if someone performs a step up or a lunge and that knee is wavering in or out, we always look at like, oh, my knee is unstable, but we need to look at it more so from the foot. How is that foot controlling with the floor? How is the hip stabilizing? Are those two joints controlling the position of the knee in the middle? A lot of runners, and what I like to add into the mix, once we get good stability, again, increase load if we have resistance, heavier exercises, and then adding some basic low-level plyometrics to teach shock absorption. So basic squat jump, not worrying about power so much, but landing, absorbing force, and trying to dissipate the force well rather than pounding hard into the ground. And then with the knees specifically, you really want to focus on running form, cadence specifically to limit overstriding. If that foot is landing too far out in front of the body, the load at the knee is drastically increased. But what we know through the research, if you increase the cadence, your cadence by 5%, you reduce the load in the knees by 20%. If you increase the cadence 10%, you reduce the load at the knee by 32%. So just increasing cadence alone would be probably a really good strategy, buying a metronome, figuring out how many steps per minute you're currently running at conversational pace and trying to increase that. Cadence goes a long way when it comes to knee health. Susan, how to overcome imbalances? And this will be the last question for tonight, unless anyone else on here has a final question. So testing, need to test things. I think seeing a lot of people that are doing general strength training programs, same amount of sets, same amount of repetitions on both sides. Looking at a lot of the runners I work with, you look at it like, wow, we're isolating all of these little things. We know this left hip is tighter. We know cramping only in the right hamstring, or I'm just making that up. I know Scott mentioned cramping in the hamstrings. So we're adding an additional set. So say for the purpose here with Scott, cramping it with a single leg bridge in the hamstring. So it might be, okay, we're going to do 3 sets of a hip bridge with marching. Our third set's only going to be on that weaker side. Because if we are imbalanced, we have this strength on this side, this strength on that side, we continue to do the same amount of sets and repetitions. I'm always curious if we ever truly catch up. But if we can isolate and tease out those imbalances over a period of time, we can start to level the playing field. things become more symmetrical from side to side. To some degree, again, we are a little bit asymmetrical in our, again, organ structure, diaphragm, these kind of internal structures. So we may not be completely perfect, but we want to minimize those imbalances as much as possible. So I think it all comes down to testing. For those of you that say, I don't know how to test, I think doing your exercises, you might notice here, my balance and my stability as I do the step up is worse on my left side than my right side. Okay, great. Let's do 3 sets of 10 on the left side. Only do the third set on your left side over a period of time as you perfect that, assuming there's no other underlying things going on. We're addressing and teasing out that weakness or that imbalance so we can hopefully kind of level the playing field, as I said. All right, guys, any last questions before we wrap up? But I appreciate you guys hanging out for the webinar. Stay tuned tomorrow, 11 a.m. I will be, like I said, sending that replay raffle winners. Hope to work with some of you over the next month within that 1 month trial, the Healthy Running Program. But once again, thank you for joining tonight. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and feel free to reach out anytime with questions. I'm happy to help.